Can I go jogging? Can I relax in the comfort of my apartment? Can I fix my car then? Can I get a pack of Skittles without a problem? Can I have a cell phone? Can I leave a party and get home? Can I play music in peace? Can I run? Can I sell CDs? Can I please go free? Can I cash my check? Can I go to the store at least? Can my queen come home, relax a minute? Can she get a normal traffic ticket? Can I check for my wallet? Can I make it to my wedding? Can I lawfully carry a weapon? Can I go ask for help and not be slain? Can I play in the park? Can I take the train? Can I party New Year's Eve? One last thing, can I breathe? Hold on, let me repeat. Let me ask you again, can I breathe?
Welcome to the conversation. Today, this is Faith in Action, Understanding Systemic Racism and Advocacy, hosted by Pastor Rosalia Johnson of Grace United Methodist Church in Arlington, Texas, and co-sponsored by the General Board of Church and Society of the United Methodist Church here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the conversation. For such a time as this, it is necessary for us to understand and work through these issues of systemic racism. And as people of faith, we just want to understand how to lean into our faith, not just to how to process it all, but how to move faithfully into action to overcome these systemic evils that we endure on a regular basis. So without further ado, I want to go right into the conversation. My name is Minister Christian S. Watkins, and I will be moderating the conversation along with Pastor Rosalia Johnson, who is with Grace United Methodist Church, and I'll pass it over to her.
So good evening, everyone. Just great to be here with you guys. Pastor Rush is actually, we had some technical difficulties, so I have him on FaceTime. Okay, so we're gonna do that. We would not be defeated tonight. This all came about, just as you know, just seeing the George Floyd incident and with Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and those things happening so closely together. And I think just on top of that, this is, we're dealing with the COVID situation where we have more time to absorb things via different platforms, whether it be the news or social media. I think that us being in and then that, but it hit me really hard. And I couldn't figure out why it hit. I mean, all of those things hit me, but this was like, it was like a gut punch. It hit me so hard. I cried for 3 days. I prayed, and I asked God, what can we do? And I think so often we opt not to do anything because we think, what can I do? But God just convicted me and said, there is something you can do. And I sent that post out, and I had the names of all of the people that you just saw on that video. And the responses that I received were overwhelming. And that was a beautiful, grace-filled thing. And from that, talked to Grace United Methodist Church. I'm the associate pastor there. I should have started off by saying that. But I talked to them and just said, there are people that are asking, what can we do? It's great to pray. It's great to think about it, but God uses people and moves us into action. And so here we are in the face of all of this. Here we are to talk about understanding the systemic racism, and not just that, but what can we do about it? What are the action steps that I hate to say it, but in 3 weeks, when something else happens and this, goes in the shadows, will we still be thinking about this? And so this is an effort to start the dialogue, to talk about it, to try to understand it, and then to move forward. Even from this, after this, we're going to have a part 2, as Christian said. Christian said, we don't have a part 2. We'll have a part 2 where we'll have open dialogue, and we'll be able to ask you, the participants that are with us, tell us some action steps that you've taken. Tell us what's happening in your community. Tell us what's happening in your city. Tell us some of the resources that you use to help further things along. And so I'll stop there because I would love for Pastor Rush to open us up in prayer.
Well, first of all, thank you everybody for the invitation. And this is very unusual. I am not real brilliant with technology, but I'm willing to learn. I'm having some difficulties getting in on my iPad or my computer, but I'm not going to stop trying. So throughout this particular broadcast, I am going to continue when I call my technicians in so that we can do it. But let's bow right now in a word of prayer. But before we pray, I want us to follow a pattern that I've asked our entire congregation to follow. And what we're doing every day, what we've been doing, is praying, first of all, giving God thanks so that you can follow me in this prayer. And then we're going to just praise God. And then we're going to ask God something personally. And then we're going to intercede for someone else. Okay, so that's the pattern we follow. Now, we just do it for 15 seconds apiece because we have a lot of brand new people who are just learning to pray. And so I try to help them to not be intimidated by trying to find the right word to pray and try to pray 2 hours. And so 15 seconds is like a minute long. So I don't know who I'm talking to. I don't know where you are in your belief stance, your weakening, your area of strength. But that's how I'm going to pray, so I want you to be on one accord with me. But this time, Father, first of all, I thank you for leading us into Sister Johnson's path. I thank you, God, for her taking initiative, for her making the move, for her making the contact. I thank you for her having the insight to say, is there something I can do, or is there something I can say, instead of saying, I'm saying nothing. But right now, Lord, everyone on this line who understands you, we praise you. Someone may understand or wonder, question, what are we praising for? We praise God because you're still worthy to be praised. Yes. We're praising you because what Satan tries to do in the midst of all of this is shut down our praise, because if he shuts down our praise, he feels like he can shut down our connection with you. So we praise you for who you are. We adore you, God. And then thirdly, God, I want to ask you right now, as I participate and others participate, I'm asking you for the wisdom. I'm asking you for the spirit of humility, to never forget that it is an honor to be asked to even just pray. And then fourth, God, I just want to say we come now interceding and praying for those who are still mad, angry, frustrated, irritated at the wrong source. I'm praying, God, that somebody today who's outside of even this death situation, somebody's child is having cancer, somebody's mother is infected with a disease, somebody's husband has strayed away, somebody's son or daughter committing murders. There are so many. Keep our arms stretched out to help others who are going through so many other crises. And we just thank you for your goodness and mercy. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen. Let me say that this could not have happened had it not been for Minister Christian Watkins. We work together with Advocacy for Social Justice and the General Board of Church and Society. I gave him a call and I said, hey, look, I don't know where this is going, but what do you think? And he and his expert, I don't know how he does all the social justice things that he does in a day. But if you go to his Facebook page, I mean, if you want to know what to do and you want to have something to do, go to Christian's page, because there's always something that he has going on that's dealing with social justice. And I just praise God for people like him. In addition to that, I want to thank all of the panelists, Pastor Ricky Rush, Dr. Heidi Miller, Reverend Kate McGee, Reverend Dr. Tamara Lewis, and is Stan Leakey on the call? But you all, I mean, right away, the response was overwhelming, saying, yes, yes, what can we do? In fact, I think you guys asked, what can we do, before I even came up with something to do. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. Thank you so much for taking the time out to participate in this, to help us figure out how we respond to this in faith and in love, living our faith, seeking justice, while also pursuing peace. Christian?
Okay, I believe we do have Stan. We do have what's his name? Stan
And
on the call.
Can I say this? I forgot to mention Pastor Bates. I'm sorry, Pastor Bates. Pastor
Ma'am,
Bates.
I know you want to get to me later. You're going to get to me later.
Okay.
All right. Well, without further ado, we just want to run. We just want to jump into the conversation. But first,
just touch it. Just touch it. Just touch it.
but first, we're going to pass to Pastor Ricky Rush in order to discuss the biblical principles, the Christian responses, and the theological understandings designed to bring the restorative work of Christ to our land. So, if we can go there, or Rosalia, did you want to go with Kate first?
Yes, I'm still here.
Yes, you're going to go first on the biblical principles.
Okay. You'll tell me when. I mean, I can hear you.
Now.
Right now?
Right now.
Okay, everybody. I'm still trying to get it together here. This is Pastor Ricky Rush. I'm here in Dallas, Texas, pastor of the Inspiring Body of Christ Church. I wanna open this up with a different approach, and I'm trying to at the same time feel quick here. But I want to look at this in a different manner, or maybe not a different manner, but to get us thinking about something here. I've asked someone people have asked me, is there anywhere that the Bible kind of mentions all of this? And I said yes. As a matter of fact, it's right there in that basic principle. When Jesus said, he was confronted by some lawyers, he was confronted by some people that they were kind of like, and the way I just want to deal with common conversation, because I'm talking to believers here. And, so God, what's the great commandment? What can we do to enter the kingdom of heaven? And Lord said, hey, okay, I'll tell you what. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, And then he said, love your neighbor as yourself. Those are 2 commandments. Of course, we know there were 10. And the Lord probably was like, okay, you didn't get all 10. You can't do 8, but can you do 2? If you can do 2, you can figure this one out. And that one that he said, love your neighbor as yourself. He tried to trap him up, right? So the trap was, okay, who is my neighbor? Now they got Jesus in the bind. Now they got him in a corner. And so Jesus, being as intelligent as he was, being God himself, remember, started to tell the story. And we know the story. He said a certain man went down from Jerusalem. And by the way, the reference that I have tonight is the scriptures. Luke 10, he said in the verse, the King James Version, a certain man, now he's getting ready to answer a question. The question is, who is my neighbor? A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who did what? They stripped him of his clothing, they wounded him, and departed it, leaving him half dead. And Jesus says, now, by chance, and this is where we fit in here, he says a certain priest came down that road. And when he saw him, he saw him. He passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived, the Levite, we know, being one of his same kinds of people, same culture, one that was like a brother in his same brotherhood, but he saw him in his condition, and what did he do? He passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed by, when he saw him, he stopped and had compassion on him. Now, what am I here to say tonight? We can't keep acting like the priest and the Levite who saw it but pretended that they didn't and passed by on the other side. All of us have the option to pass by on the other side. We're here tonight because Reverend Johnson decided, no, we can't just keep pretending that we don't see this. We can't keep pretending that because we know God and because we know how good and merciful God is, that we can't see this. So my question to those is, what are we not seeing? This looks so obvious, doesn't it? Yeah, I know it. But we're all missing how obvious this really is. This may not make headline news that I'm about to say to you right now. But Jesus another time went out and there was a great storm, and he stood above among that storm and he said, "Peace, be still." And when he said, "Peace, be still," the wind stopped blowing and the sea got calm. Now when he said, "Peace, be still," listen very carefully. Either the wind and the water hurt him, behind it hurt him because it stopped. Something else to realize that he never was talking to wind and water, but he was talking to whoever was behind it, which was Satan. When we understand that Satan is the source, this becomes too big to miss. Now, if I was Satan, I would make us point every finger at white people, black people, police officers, racists. I'd make us point all of those fingers at people to make sure that we didn't point the finger at him. He's the source. He's behind all of it. And we can grasp every right that we know we have and still miss the source. So when they passed by on the other side, both of them, there was a Samaritan that came by. He had compassion on him. Are we missing the picture here? Jesus is saying, don't miss it. We've got to start addressing the source. And sometimes it seems as if God is being blamed for things, and people are angry at God. And Satan is having a ball with this. He's loving every bit of it because we are missing the source. There are young people right now who are hating God. People who are cursing God. And Satan is supplying all the bricks. He's supplying all the mortar. He's supplying all the paths. He's supplying all the hate. He's supplying everything because we are still missing the source. He's the source behind all of the hate. So what did the guy do? Well, here's when the Lord steps in. And he picks us up. He takes us to a place of healing, which is why we're here now. And he tells the innkeeper in the story in Luke, the 10th chapter, he says, take care of it. I'm going to leave you some money, and whatever he needs, I'll take care of it in the morning. Well, whoever this Samaritan was, this guy that was the least likely to come was the guy that took care of him. God is sometimes sending us the least likely to help us. We have watched people come together during the coronavirus. I mean, who in their right mind would come to your house, see you walk in the street, ask you if you need a tissue? Lysol? Really? So are we really having racist issues? Are we really having black and white issues? Just a couple of weeks ago, folks, we were having tissue issues. And now we're having other issues, but the source is still the same. Satan thought he had us scared straight. We were running from a virus. So now he wants us to feel like we have to leave Jerusalem. Remember the story now. The man left Jerusalem. He wants us to leave because Jerusalem represented that place of righteousness, of holiness. He wants us to leave that to go down to Jericho, because that's where most of us that are born again came from. Everybody got some Jericho in them. So he was leaving where he was to go down to Jericho. And he fell among thieves. Satan would love for us to leave the faith that we have in God, to go down into that other life that we remember of hatred, violence, and non-peace. And figure it out for ourselves and get involved with a flesh and blood war instead of using the power of prayer. Now it's going to take your faith to come into play. And if we say we're believing and we're trusting God, then we have to do like Jesus did. When he calmed that sea, I know I'm bringing in two stories here, but I'm about up with my time. He stood up and he spoke to that sea. He said, I'm not teaching you something you don't already know. I know it. But so many times, we don't know who to blame. So many times, we don't know who to fault. And when he said, peace be still, think about it. All of that wind blowing, that didn't wake up Jesus. All of that water hit the side of the boat, that didn't wake up Jesus. All of that tossing and turning, that didn't wake up Jesus. But when his boys said, Master, don't you care that we perish? In all that storm, it's amazing that the sound of one of his partners calling out to him is what woke him up. And I believe the sound of us calling out to him is moving God. It moves him. And if you keep watching the news, you'll see that he heard your cry. There's an old song that we used to sing. I don't know if you're singing it anymore. I love the Lord. He heard my cry. Yeah. It's amazing. All the things that I've done, it took me crying for God to hear me. But somebody cried who didn't know it. And somebody started protesting. And God is saying, while you're protesting, I'm protecting. I'll take care of you.
Hey, now.
All right.
We do have a biblical framework in order to work this thing out, and we do have the tools in order to understand how we are supposed to respond faithfully. We just have to have the right perspective and the right teachers to help us do that. So, with that same vein, I am a man of prayer. I'm a man of the Bible. However, after I pray, it's been reiterated to me over and over again that after I pray, got to get on my feet and do something with my hands and with my voice. So in that same vein, Reverend Kate McGee, can you go ahead and let us know what faith in action looks like?
Thank you guys again so much for this invitation. I feel very honored and privileged to be in this space. I'm so grateful particularly to Reverend Johnson for our friendship and collegiality here in Arlington, and thankful for this. So faith in action. Some of you preacher types might know the Festival of Homiletics, and I was there a couple years ago when the preacher was talking about lots of good things, as she does. And she talked about if you had faith, or if you had works, and if you had action, and you had justice, seeking justice, but you didn't have faith, you weren't going to have the energy to sustain what you need to do. And so for my beliefs about anti-racism work is for me very much rooted in the Bible, rooted in the scriptures. We know James says that faith without works is dead. But many of us, and particularly white people here, struggle with what that looks like on a systemic change, right? To use Pastor Rush's example, we might be really good at helping that Samaritan out. We might be really good at tending to wounds. We are really good at charity, at writing checks, at donating food, and that is important, right? We have to stop the bleeding of the immediate crisis. But as Dr. King said, we also have to ask, what's going on that road to Jericho that people are getting beat up, that they're being left on the side to dead? What is happening on a bigger picture? And that's more challenging for those of us who want to put our faith into action. It's much harder to change that way. Often, particularly as white people, it requires something of us in a different way. It costs something of us, maybe our time, maybe our comfort levels, maybe our very sense of self and worldview, to realize these things have always been happening and they're just now being filmed. To realize that what we were told when we were grown up wasn't the whole truth, wasn't the whole history, and that today is not happening in a vacuum. And so that's very, very challenging. And I'm a Presbyterian, and we have a historic emphasis on education. And so I was thinking about, well, where does action begin? And I think about all the people like Nicodemus, good religious man, right? Goes up to Jesus and says, but wait, how do I get this? Or the rich young ruler who goes up to Jesus and says, how do I get to heaven? People are always asking Jesus questions. They come to him, they seek to learn. And tonight, most of what I'm saying is geared towards white people, because I think we have a lot of learning and a lot of unlearning to do to be able to take appropriate action. And so it's also really important that we don't rely solely on our Black friends and colleagues to do the work for us. There is a lot out there. We live in an amazing time where there are so many resources at our fingertips that we cannot put one more burden on them, but instead to take that on ourselves to seek out things. I really appreciate, and I believe Christian has the screen for you, a challenge that my Presbyterian siblings at Myers Park Presbyterian Church put together. It's called Better When We're Back Together. And it's an invitation for a 21-day challenge. They have compiled an exhaustive, well, not exhaustive, but a really, and if you can scroll down a little bit there, Christian, you can see it has all these resources, and you pick something to read or watch or listen, and every day you track this planning tool. At Westminster, at my church, where I am the pastor in Arlington, we'll be starting this challenge on June 14th, the Sunday before Juneteenth, but has all these options. Anyone's welcome to join us. You can join this. I would invite you to invite your close friends or families to do it with you. Invite your church to do this. But as you can see, not only has things been written and filmed and made, but then we have people who have put these options together for you to read and engage. And so that's one really excellent opportunity. We can definitely put the link in the chat. But another option is, I know most of us are probably still worshiping online in some way, which means not only can you go to your church from your comfy couch, but you have a chance to hear voices of faith. You can go and listen to a minister who's of a different race than you. Go listen to what the Black churches are saying. They are doing the work for you. Go find it, enjoy it, revel in the gospel truth they are offering. We all just got a tiny taste from Pastor Rush tonight, but hear what they are seeing going on. So our church traveled through an anti-racism Sunday school several years ago. And I see Bill and Gail Cobb are on here tonight, and I'm so grateful. They stuck with me through all 12 weeks of it. We did an exercise called How Diverse is Your Universe? And we considered the race of our close friends, our family, our doctors, our favorite actors and singers and authors. And there was a stark realization. For most white people, our universe is fairly homogenous. And so one thing we can do, it's really not that hard as we continue this learning journey. Read books by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And not just anti-racism works, which of course you should read, but read theology by Howard Thurman and James Cone, fantasy by N.K. Jemisin, poetry and memoir by Saeed Jones, a good Texan, or the novel by Ta-Nehisi Coates, The Water Dancer. Watch movies with majority Black cast and not just slave movies. There's a world of creativity out there. And through the power of art, we're often given the gift to step into someone else's story, to see things in new and different ways. It's the closest we get to stepping into shoes that we'll never be able to walk. And I think the Bible knows the power of stories. When we hear these stories, something happens. Something changes us. We can no longer pretend to walk by and that we don't see once we know these stories. Our denomination offers training workshops, including anti-racism, cultural humility, and power and privilege. Ask your faith leaders where you can learn more about things. I'm sure Christian and the general board do all sorts of things like this as well. And once again, now's the time when we are moving everything online. It is an awesome time to jump in and engage this work in a real way. And learning doesn't have to stop at home. Earlier this year, I went on a racial justice pilgrimage with friends at a Presbyterian church in Dallas, led by Michael Waters, who many of you SMU and Dallas people probably know well. We traveled by charter bus across the Deep South, visiting important sites in the civil rights movement. And while we rode the bus, we discussed what we had seen. We didn't just see something and move on, right? You had to engage with it. We watched films and documentaries along the way. But there's something about standing on the bridge where Emmett Till was thrown into the river that takes root in your soul. Or when we met the only survivor from the bathroom of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, where 4 little girls were killed by a bomb. Go out, experience this. These opportunities are here right now. This is not something that happened a long time ago, although it is, right? It's all connected. But there's opportunities right now and right here to learn and engage. And then once you are rooted in that history, in that context, once you can understand that slavery never ended, it just changed, then you can look to the leaders in your city and see what they're doing. Listen to the NAACP and look at the events they organize. Do you know you don't have to be Black to join the NAACP? Encourage your church to befriend a church that's made up predominantly of a different race. Some of the greatest joys in my ministries here in Arlington has been born out of my friendships with pastors. And we have built up where we come back and forth between each other churches. And it is a huge, huge gift for us. Because you have these projects where you're working side by side, building relationships in the name of Christ. You know that, well, maybe you different on how you baptize, but you come together because you believe God's kingdom should be here and now, right? And you listen to each other, you learn from each other, you create that space. You know you won't agree on everything, but you take that risk anyway. Show up. Even when it's not about you, especially when it's not about you. Show up to that march, to that prayer vigil, to something that you think, well, it doesn't actually affect me, but I'm going to show up anyway, right? Because it affects your sisters and brothers in Christ. It affects people, and so it affects you. Sign petitions presented by local organizers. Talk to your city council members and your school board members. Ask them hard questions. Don't let the paralyzing worry of saying something wrong mean that you say nothing at all. Reverend Johnson talked about our eagerness to respond to this. And I will tell you, I was nervous that I'm going to say something wrong, but I cannot let that stop me from saying something at all. When you struggle to find words, look at what your Black local leaders are already saying. Use your privilege to amplify their ideas, right? And with that in note, it's important to say that not everyone can do all the things. We can't go to every single particular protest that's going on right now in Arlington. There's one tomorrow and there's this and that. You have to know your lane. So don't try to occupy all the lanes, but pick one, right? Maybe you can't march, but you could call elected officials. Maybe you can't organize, but you can amplify those messages. We know the Spirit gives out all kinds of gifts and that they work together for God's glory, that they work together for the goodness of our world. Faith in action doesn't mean we always get it right or we'll always know what to say. Faith in action means we keep going not by our own might or power, but by the Holy Spirit. And just as our journeys of faith are never really over, so too are our journeys of discipleship, of learning, of pushing and pulling for God's kingdom. We cannot rest until the kingdom on earth is as it is in heaven, until we are truly one in Christ Jesus, whether that's Jew or Greek, male or female, Black or white, conservative or liberal, Methodist or Presbyterian. That is our goal. And I say this with lots of love to my white family, but we have a lot of work to do to get there. And yet we know everything is possible with God. So do something. That's what I got.
Thank you so very much, Kate, for that. And it is just a pleasure to hear those kind of recommendations and whatnot that you have offered and the explanations that you gave behind it. You know, it is possible to turn that corner from charity to doing justice. You know, as Micah 6:8 says, we know what the Lord requires of us to make justice happen, to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. And I do believe that with that, we have to walk humbly with our God who dwells among us, because God is not dead, God is yet alive, and God is walking with us. God is within us. So we have to own that, but we have to understand that how we lean into that. And if Rosalia would actually give me a little bit of leeway, I'd like to go to Reverend Dr. Tamara Lewis of Perkins School of Theology to help us to understand the historical context of racism, rebellion, and the backlash of white supremacy in society, in the church, and what we as Christians must do now. So if you would, Dr. Lewis, take over from here.
Thank you, Minister Watkins, and I want to extend my thanks to Reverend Johnson for inviting me. I would like to greet everyone on the panel and all who are listening. Really wonderful to see you, Reverend Dr. Miller. Also wonderful to see you, Reverend Bates, and everyone. It's just an honor to be here, and I'm just truly thankful to have this opportunity. We are truly in a moment of history, and as a history professor, it's just an honor to pray and think and covenant with the people of God who are actively engaged in the struggle. So I'll start. In recent days, the unprecedented response to the unprovoked killing of George Floyd reflects built-up public outrage regarding the militarization of the police in America. However, the horrific nature of Floyd's death, the death of Breonna Taylor, and the deaths of countless others at the hands of law enforcement officers is indicative of at least two fundamental historical realities. First, police brutality has a long-standing precedent in this country. It is rooted in the historic institution of slavery and the consequent racism fueled by white supremacy. Secondly, slavery as an institution, while formally abolished in one phase after the Civil War, lived on in other multiple aspects. These aspects include racism and white supremacy, which shifted institutionally into other systems that perpetuated economic and political racism. The establishment of Jim Crow laws after the Reconstruction phase of the Civil War deemed African Americans as second-class citizens in this country. As Michelle Alexander in the book The New Jim Crow has taught us, and most recently demonstrated in Ava DuVernay's Netflix documentary, 13th, structural racism ensured white economic prosperity and supremacy, buttressed by the prison system. Free prison labor substituted free slave labor. Bodies were corralled by law enforcement and unequal justice systems to provide a disproportionate number of African American prisoners. Police forces and courts operated within the oppressive segregated culture of Jim Crow, legally sanctioned by the 1896 Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson, which required not only the legal separation and inferior status of Blacks, but also recognition of a white supremacist culture, which ensured that Blacks had socially and publicly better defer to whites at all times. This public culture was not only policed by law enforcement, but also the average, typical white citizen, mimicking the slave patrols that had been used in the antebellum period to keep enslaved persons in line. If you've ever read books on the history of slavery, even novels on slavery, you're well aware of the slave patrols in which individual enslaved persons would have to confront if they were called upon to travel from one plantation or farm to the other. Any individual white person could stop and police a Black person who would normally be enslaved in the South and essentially challenge them and challenge or question their status. The point is, despite the passage of time, this culture has not changed. Therefore, as we all know, when George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin back in 2012, Zimmerman was participating in this tradition. Individual citizens policing Black persons. The recent public awareness of white individuals making ridiculous one 911 calls in order to police and intimidate African American persons is simply another instantiation of this historic tradition. Most recently, when Amy Cooper, the white woman who called the police on Christian Cooper, an African American gentleman in Central Park, I could not help but reflect on the 1921 Tulsa City Massacre, which took place May 31st and June 1st, 99 years ago. And in today's money, destroyed millions of dollars in Black businesses and residences, not to mention hundreds of Black lives. This event, this horribly infamous event, was instigated by the accusation of a white woman against a Black man. Civilian policing of Blacks has traditionally resulted in Black deaths in America. This culture, alive and well after Reconstruction at the turn of the 20th century, withstood the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Although the civil rights movement was effective in dismantling legalized segregation and Jim Crow, it did not eradicate the long-standing institutional and structural racism that leads to economic inequality for the majority of African Americans. Ironically, it was after the civil rights movement that the constant policing and surveillance of Black bodies, rooted in American history and instigated by private citizens as well as law enforcement alike, increased due to the rise of the prison industrial complex in the 80s and 90s. The increased corporate privatization of prisons, a big money source that requires more and more incarcerated bodies to make huge profits, led to legislative policy which disproportionately prosecutes African Americans and Latinos for previously held light offenses, leading to the exponential ratio of the number of Blacks and Browns in the prison system. And may I add that the legislative policy, which was implemented in the 80s and the 90s, which created these so-called initiatives such as the war on drugs that led to the exponential numbers of Black and brown persons in prisons, these policies were supported by both Republican and Democratic presidents as well as members of Congress. Within the specter of terroristic racial profiling, aggressive searches and seizures and deadly reactions to the least provocations, the culture of white supremacy pervades in the consciousness of many officers on police forces. This culture requires not only Black subjugation, but also deems Black persons inferior and Black lives inconsequential. In other words, when it comes to the use of deadly force, Black lives don't matter. According to the Mapping Police website.org or mappingpoliceviolence.org, a website which tracks the statistics of police violence in this country, Blacks are 3 times more likely to be killed by police, 1.3 times more likely to be killed unarmed, and further, larger local police forces, that is, forces that are armed with more of a military apparatus, kills Blacks at higher rates, although levels of crime in municipal and other local areas are not a determination of rates of violence. So, for example, the state of Oklahoma, where I just mentioned the Tulsa massacre having taken place 99 years ago, hosts one of the largest police forces in the country, located in Oklahoma City. This police force has the 2nd largest rate of police killing in the country. When one reflects on the historic precedent of the culture of violence perpetuated against Blacks in this state, one becomes aware of the historic legacy associated with the explosion of violence that we observe today. Incidentally, one of my own ancestors was a Black man who was lynched in Oklahoma in 1911, 5 years after Oklahoma became a state and formally established Jim Crow segregation. This ancestor of mine was my grandmother's great uncle, my great-grandmother's uncle. He was the owner of a barber shop in Coweta, Oklahoma, and killed by the local police because he challenged a group of white men who were beating up a Black boy outside of his shop. When my great-grandmother's uncle was killed, her great uncle, which was her father's brother, the entire family was forced to flee in terror because of fear that the police forces and the local law enforcement would seek out other members of his family. In the eyes of the sheriff and other law enforcement who killed my ancestor, no Black man had the right to stand up to any white man for anything. This culture remains pervasive in many aspects of today's society, particularly among a substantial number of law enforcement officials. Therefore, what we're witnessing today is not new. As Will Smith said, police been killing Black people. However, what is new is an intimate awareness of this historic legacy due to developments in technology that allow unprecedented access to images of these brutal acts in real time. But there is hope. There is, as Jesse Jackson would say, a rainbow coalition of all races and ethnicities right now in the streets, challenging not only specific acts of terror, as in the case of George Floyd, but also this historic tradition. And this also has historic precedent. The civil rights movement of the 1960s helped to achieve legal rights for equality and the dismantling of segregation, not primarily through the actions of individuals, although in the aftermath, individuals such as Martin Luther King have been glorified. But the actual achievements did not take place without the collective mobilization of great numbers of individuals in a mass movement in nonviolent and sometimes violent eruptions. Progress emerged from the power of collective movements. During the civil rights era, images of unprovoked killing and beating by the police shocked the masses and were available upon a relatively new technology, the TV screen. People all over the world were outraged, and they joined the mass movement and support of that movement to eradicate legalized segregation. Thus, the precedent of the collection and the mass of the movement of peoples that are mobilizing all over the world and throughout the country represents historical moments in our tradition in which injustice has been challenged and dismantled. However, economic racism and structural racism remain, and this is what we are facing today. In addition to protest and mobilization, and we've seen even the progress, people yelling and screaming and protesting in the streets has resulted in the 4 policemen being arrested and charged. But structural racism will not be abolished until there's substantive policy change, legislative change. Just as legislation instituted a system of 2 justice systems, one for Black and one for white, we need legislative policies that will change police forces in America. Mass movements bring about systemic change, but we need further organization in order to oversee the systemic and structural dismantling that is necessary to establish justice in this country. The beginning is taking place through the call of young people today who are calling for systemic change. Institutions are also calling for systemic change. Some of the recommendations include the removal of military equipment from neighborhoods as tools of policing, Congress no longer transferring military equipment to local police forces, the creation of police reform initiatives and community-oriented policing strategies that will take down the policies that many officers have to shoot first and ask questions later. And a number of policies are being recommended. This requires a follow-through and a see-through on the part of protesting communities. Mass mobilization must continue in order to petition legislatures in local and state apparatuses to challenge and de-establish the policies leading to police brutality. Finally, as many of my colleagues have been establishing, we have an example in Jesus. Jesus was a freedom fighter. Jesus sought to empower communities. Jesus sought to liberate the masses by helping the masses liberate themselves. Through the teaching, preaching, and healing of Jesus, he inspired the common people who had emotionally, psychologically, and physically been downtrodden by the Roman state and Jewish elites in collusion with the state. Jesus' movement was nonviolent, but Jesus empowered the people to stand up collectively against oppression. Therefore, despite the history of injustice in this country, the mobilization of the collective in our history is actually part of the Jesus tradition. The rise of the Jesus movement, inspired by the example of the one who did not back down to the state, who did not back down to police violence and oppression, but endured the killing and endured the sacrifice in order to rise again and lead the people to mobilize as a collective to continue the struggle. As I'm reminded by Angela Davis, the struggle is a continual process. There are fits and there are starts, there are gains and there are losses. Many of us in our own activity, in our own good works, stand on the mountaintop looking at the promised land, never to actually participate in, and yet know that we as a people, as an American people, will make it to the promised land. Therefore, the collective must engage in the continual struggle. Victory is in the resistance. We win when we resist. We win by resisting evil. We win by opposing power. We win in the fight, and we will be ultimately victorious through the collective, where 2 or 3 are gathered in body and in spirit. We are community. We are connected, and Christ is with us. I'll stop there.
Amen. Thank you very much, Dr. Lewis. And it is true that, you know, slavery and racism didn't end at the end of the Civil War. It just evolved. And while racism is still alive and well in this country and all over this world, I know that God is real, and God is showing out right now in the will of other people. And to continue that conversation, I want to kick it to Pastor Fred Bates for a perspective from law enforcement.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everybody. And again, I want to thank everybody for being present with us tonight. It is it's an honor to be on a panel with such as was stated earlier, esteemed guests, theologians, pastors, legal advisors. I am currently the pastor of Grace UMC Arlington, right in the middle of the DFW Metroplex, and so have a unique position in that I have also served in law enforcement, have a law enforcement background of 22 years. Just a little background to give you some context on where I am. I started in the city, started serving the police department or policing in the city of New Orleans in 1997. This was approximately 2 or 3 years following some of the most violent days in the streets of New Orleans when 450 people were murdered. And part of the murders that took place in that city in 1994, 5, and 6 were at the hands of 2 rogue police officers, one by the name of Lynn Davis, who was African American and ordered a assassination of a young lady who attempted to file a police complaint upon him. The second person was Antoinette Frank, who, along with a individual who she was dating at the time, robbed and murdered a police officer as well as several members of a family, of a Vietnamese family who was attempting to hire her as a part-time duty. This is the context that I started my police work with a police department that was out of control. And what I want to say here is that it is not an issue just of race, it's an issue of police culture. And I want us to clearly understand that, because I'm glad you called me right after Dr. Lewis, because she brought up some extremely important points about understanding police culture and how do we legislate change. There are some and you've probably heard this all day, there's some very good police officers. But how do we get that one person, like a Chauvin, to come in and destroy everything that every good police officer works for? Well, let me give you some background on that. Number one, and most of you, if you don't know this, make a note of it. It takes 1,000 hours of study and work to get a barber's license. It takes 1,000 hours to get a cosmetology license, 1,000 hours of study to get a cosmetology license in the state of Texas. T-Code, the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement, only requires 696 hours in order to get a peace officer's license in the state of Texas. I teach 2 classes at a police department in the state of, in this Metroplex. The first class I teach is multiculturalism, which is extremely important in understanding how to police neighborhoods, particularly neighbors that are not like you. Second thing I do is I teach ethics and professionalism. This is doing what's right because it's right, even when no one is looking. I get 8 hours for multiculturalism, and I get 8 hours for ethics. 40 hours a week, 40 hours in that 696 hour time period, 40 hours is spent learning how to pursuit drive. 40 hours is spent on learning how to handle and pass firearm proficiency. These things are important when you're dealing with law enforcement and you're dealing with your life is on the line. These things are important. But think about the amount of time that's spent training in learning how to fight, learning how to drive, learning how to training in firearms, as compared to the amount of time that most police officers will spend in learning how to communicate with a person that does not look like them. And so what you have is a systematic police culture that drives individuals who start off, most people come on a job saying, I just want to help people. But by the time they have gone through the training, the rigors of training, and been told hundreds of times that your life could be in danger. It is a systematic, complex changing of a person's attitude to help them understand that you want to go home at night. And so how do you deal with a culture like that? How do you deal with a culture of individuals who have never met or had very little contact with an African-American person to now tell them that that person could be the person that will take your life? And so what you're talking about is a culture of policing that has to change. Now, I'm going to go back just a few years ago. President Obama commissioned a study, and it was published through the Department of Justice, and it was dealing with the 21st century policing, an outstanding model of understanding community policing. Outstanding. The problem with this was that the police departments across the country were not required to take the report and then to institute the changes that were in the report. What does that mean for us? Here's what it simply means: this. Only police departments that have a strong leadership and individuals who are dedicated to community policing, only those police departments will make the changes. This is why you have some police departments that are doing great work, and some police departments like we see in Minneapolis, who are no longer effective in understanding their community. How does a person, and this is a question that no one even has to answer because it's clear, how does a person rack up 18 complaints in the course of a 20-year period? How does a person become involved in 3 shootings when you have police officers that have gone for 40 years and have never even pulled their gun in anger? And you have this person still on the job, still has had to take no extra training, or even better yet, how is this person even still on the job? And those are the questions that municipalities and states have to begin to ask their local police departments. There is a very important aspect of local police departments that I think many people need to understand, and that is police departments are not required to be commissioned. In other words, accredited. There's no requirement that requires a police department to be accredited. There is a great national accreditation process called CALEA. It's Commission on Law Enforcement Accreditation. This will require police departments to undergo training, to consistently look at how they police, how they handle social justice issues. It requires them to do so. It was amazing when a colleague of mine did an investigation into Minnesota. Not one police department in Minnesota is accredited through CALEA. That is absolutely astounding. And so what we do is we see these festering Ferguson, Missouris, and Minneapolis, Minnesotas. We see these places begin to fester and bring on and contain or keep these police officers on board where there is no higher level of accountability. We as citizens, we as police officers must hold individuals accountable. I was talking to a police chief in this area just yesterday, and this police chief said something that I felt was very profound. He said this: we try hard to root out and to stop individuals who we believe would not make quality police officers. We try to get them in the front end. We have a very strong background check. We put them through a psychological battery of exams. We do everything possible to keep them with training and to keep them out of harm's way, or when I say harm's way, putting them into harm's way where the public is concerned. He says we try to do that, but there could be that one Chauvin that slips through the crack. He said this, and this is what was profound about it. We may have one on our department right now that we've not identified, that we've not We've not been able to determine that this person does not need to wear the badge, but it would be impossible to find 4 of them rather, that would stand around and not do anything about what Chauvin was doing. That's a person, that chief of police, and I can vouch for him, that person knows his department. That person has invested the time to root out and to weed out individuals that do not need to carry the badge. There's several people that we know. Listen, someone asked me this, and I'll close it with this last statement. Someone asked me, is there any way conceivably possible that this person had no other option than what he did, as far as sitting on Brother Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and almost 9 minutes? And I will tell you that there is no police officer in the country, none, that deserve to wear the badge and carry a gun that would tell you that that was justified, that would tell you that that was not just unconscionable as a police officer, as a professional, but also as a human being. So my quest, I believe, from this panel is to challenge municipalities to hold their police departments accountable by getting accredited, by mandating training in community policing. And then lastly, of the 696 hours that Texas requires right now, I submit that every police officer that comes to get a job in the next, I would say from now on, we need to add 9 more minutes. 9 more minutes of training. Every police officer should be required to watch all 9 minutes of what happened in Minneapolis on that street. Every police officer that comes in, that should be a required 9-minute video, because there is no way possible that a person that says, I want to protect and serve, can stand there and say that this is protecting and serving. I yield my time.
Thanks for that, Reverend Bates. I mean, there are questions. There's a couple of questions that folks have asked in the chat room that I wanted you to specifically address,
Absolutely.
if you will.
Yeah.
The one of them is, what role does civil service play in bringing back problematic police officers?
Civil service is one of the biggest problems with bringing back problematic police officers. Just let me give you an example. For instance, and we're in the middle of the DFW Metroplex. The city of Arlington is the only police department within that. When you talk about Fort Worth, you talk about Arlington, Irving, Grand Prairie. City of Arlington is the only one that does not have civil service protection. What that does is that gives the police chief the right to fire a person at will. Now, many people would say, well, I don't want to work for a department like that. Well, the problem that comes with that is if you follow the guidelines, the simple formulated training that's there, if you follow the training, yes, things happen quickly. Yes, your life is in danger on several occasions, but follow the guidelines. You have protection within policy. Policy is key. The problem that happens is if an investigation of an officer goes wrong, the officer may have done everything that was complained about him. The allegations may be correct, but if the investigation, if an I was not dotted, if a T was not crossed, that officer could get their job back, and you again have a problematic officer on a police force that a police chief could not fire. So it is problematic in many ways.
Thank you for answering that question. I have another question that came through. Let me see if I can pull that up. And if you guys saw me black out a couple of times, I love technology. And so I have this love, not so love thing going on over here. But there was a question. Let me see if I can find it. Christian, can you pull that question up for me, please?
Was it the question about what steps can a local church do to take hold or to take?
The Candace Owen question, I think.
Oh, no, okay. So this is for all the panelists, or this is for Fred as well as for Dr. Lewis. If you would, there was a question in the chat room that said, how do you recommend we respond to family members and friends who send us things such as Candace Owens videos entitled, "I do not support George Floyd"? This was just forwarded to me with a predictable note. This is an educated Black woman. I wanted to know what you think. So Fred and Dr. Lewis, if you would.
Dr. Lewis, I'm going to let you go first, ma'am.
Okay, am I muted? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I am aware of who Candace Owens is, but I'm not aware of the video. Is she saying that she doesn't, is the video saying that she doesn't support the protest?
I haven't seen the video either. Have any of y'all seen that video?
I have not.
No?
No one has?
No.
Okay, well, the little bit that I do know of her, this is why it's really important to be aware of individuals, particularly in the public sphere, and what is their motivation. It has come to my attention that she is among a number of individuals who is actually financed by particular corporate entities to have a public intellectual persona and represent an extreme right position, particularly as an African-American woman. This is part of, and this is something that is very important for us to be aware of, the way that corporate interests, this is a capitalist society. Okay, I mean, we have to remind ourselves of this because sometimes the mainstream narrative is manipulated in multiple ways by entities behind the scenes, if you will. And these are the same corporate interests that fund various lobbying PACs and organizations that manipulate and persuade legislatures to vote and fund and institute certain policies that benefit corporate interest. So I am not sure if she is an individual who is actually in the public sphere representing her actual position, or if she is actually being manipulated or controlled by other interests. So this is the kind of thing that we have to be aware of and to educate ourselves on. Who is representing, or who is this individual representing, or what is the institution or the organization that she's standing with or representing or standing for. So I would be very cautious of with family members about just feeding into individuals like that unless their background is investigated.
Gotcha. Yeah, like you and Dr. Miller have ingrained in my seminary and spirit, we have to check our sources.
Mm-hmm.
So
exactly.
That kind of research is necessary, and we know that there are several voices out there. It just depends on who they're trying to uplift, as well as what institutions they're trying to maintain.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Can we pause for a second? I have some participants that are on the call, and we didn't tell them much about our background. So before we get to Attorney Stan and Reverend Dr. Miller and Minister Christian, could we go back and can we start with you, Kate? Could you tell us about you, where you're from, and what church you're at?
Sure.
And the same for everyone. Let's do that.
I'm Reverend Kate McGee, the very proud pastor at Westminster Presbyterian Church here in Arlington, Texas. Way leads on to way. I actually pastor in my hometown. So I graduated in Arlington, spent about 12 years elsewhere, and God called me home. So it's a gift to minister with the people of Arlington.
Reverend Dr. Lewis.
Okay, I am assistant professor of the history of Christianity at Perkins School of Theology, SMU, and I'm also an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, Tennessee Conference.
Pastor Fred Bates.
Yes, ma'am. I am Fred Bates, pastor of Grace UMC Arlington. I also am an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church and have in excess of 22 years of law enforcement background.
Wow.
Pastor Bates, what conference are you with? If you
Central Texas.
Gotcha. Cool deal.
Yeah, Pastor Johnson, Rosalia Johnson,
Oh,
Pastor Johnson. Remember, she's associate pastor right there. We are colleagues right there.
That's right. That's right. I forgot. I apologize for that oversight.
We are right there together. I wanted to say this. Some of the responses that I received, I think one of the reasons that I received some of the responses that I received, and I wanted to, now that I can use my phone, I'm not holding it up for, so you can see someone. I just wanted to read a few of those that were so encouraging and some of those that were not that encouraging that helped me know that this is something that needed to be done. And I also want everyone that's watching to know that sometimes we don't all agree. I'm sure on this, even with the panelists here, you know, we take a different approach to things. We have a different approach, and some of us have different philosophies. But I think one thing we can all agree on is that we serve a God whose mercy endures forever. And the hope that we have, you know that song, "My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus." That is what we stand on. That's why we're here. We're talking about how we can respond to this as well, but we don't want you to not know what's going on. And I also want to say this. I had so many comments saying systemic racism, and it was just like, you know, I don't want to be a part of that. Are you saying that we're all racist? No.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that you're racist. I also had the question, and, you know, I'm not a racist. I'm not a part of the system. And I would say that there, maybe dig deeper into that, but this is how I have handled those questions and even handled some of the comments that were not in line. I had a lot of people disagree with just the title alone, understanding systemic racism. And so my approach, and this is something that I've had for a long time, because I am Pastor Rosalia Johnson. I am an associate pastor at Grace United Methodist Church in Arlington, Texas. I am on the general board of Church and Society with Advocates for Social Justice. But this was put out by the General Commission on Religion and Race. And it is simply called Learning from Strangers. And one of the things that they talk about in here, and let me give you a little bit about the context of my ministry. I have been an associate pastor at a predominantly white church. I've been a senior pastor at a white church. And now I'm an associate pastor at a Black church. And so, and my heart is, like Martin Luther King Jr. said, I have a dream, you know, that one day. And so I have a heart for multiculturalism. It hurts me that Sunday is one of the most segregated days of the week. It really does. It hurts me that is our reality still in 2020. And so when I was responding or choosing not to respond or choosing how to respond, and most of the time I responded to everybody. And sometimes that response was, I would love to have a conversation with you, because there's so much lost in translation on Facebook via text message. You can't hear the tone in my voice. You can't hear the love in my heart. You can't hear any of that. And even with some people, if they don't know you, they're just not going to accept what you have to say anyway. And so dealing with them in patience, non-judgmentalism, just because I feel a certain way about what's happening in the world doesn't mean everybody feels that way. I think things hit people differently at different times. This happened to George Floyd. It affected me in a way that I haven't even fully processed exactly why. I've come up with some things, but it's still so new for me. I haven't even finished processing it. But I could tell you one thing. If anybody has a son or a daughter or any relative in their life, and that happened to them, it would affect them, period. And so as a family of God, as a family of believers, forget about race if you want to, as a child of God, we're made in God's image. This is a child of God. And so if that doesn't, just on the spiritual level, so dealing with them in patience, non-judgmentalism, tolerance, and teaching. So one of the important things is figuring out why people are afraid and what's different about you, and move forward step by step. That's one of the things that, one of the reasons that I love multicultural ministry. One of the reasons that I was not afraid to go into a white church was simply because I believe that's how you dispel some of the stereotypical ideas of what Black looks like. And when I say that, I mean, I happen to be Black, but Black doesn't look like any one particular thing. We're all different, just like anybody else. I remember being asked not to make our church too Black. And my response was, I really don't know what that means. I wasn't even upset. I really seeking understanding. What does that even mean? What does church too Black mean? What does that mean? I was born in Dallas, raised in Abilene, Texas. I'll just leave that there. Be genuine and love people for who they are. Don't be afraid to speak truth about hard issues, including those related to race and culture. What I've realized, though, is one thing, this is something Pastor Bates, this is a term he uses, which is wonderful. He says, you have to have some leadership capital, and you have to gain their respect first before you try to have these. And then, just in my experience, building relationships with people helps people listen to things and talk about things that they wouldn't be willing to talk to about or with anyone else. And that is what has happened. I've been overwhelmed by that. I have white friends who, when they want to know something, they'll call or send me a message because they know that my first instance is not going to be offense. I have built a relationship with them, so I know they're seeking understanding. So speak openly and honestly about culture and racism, which is what we're doing, cross-cultural community. And then just love people. Just love people. God calls us to love God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. And when we think on that spiritual level of loving our neighbors as ourselves, that's a lot of love, hopefully. I want my final words on this part to be, as it relates to systemic racism and people being uncomfortable with that terminology. Just because a person is uncomfortable doesn't make it not true. I think Reverend Dr. Lewis, Reverend Kate McGee, even Pastor Bates, they've given us the history. We can't ignore that. And we cannot continue to sit by and do nothing. And we can't wait on somebody else to do it. If we're all sitting around waiting on somebody to do it, it's not gonna get done. True peace is not merely the absence of tension. It is the presence of justice. And that is a quote by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Turn it over to you, Christian.
I haven't been said that. Let's talk to Stan. He was the lawyer for the Sandra Bland family when they presented their lawsuit. So Let's see, Stan, can you talk to us about the experience from a legal perspective and actions that could help us?
Thank you, Minister Watkins. I'd be happy to. I actually was not the Bland family's lawyer. I was, and I, this is my perspective. I was actually an attorney for an organization called the Texas Association of Counties. And one of the things that or TAC, and one of the things that TAC does in our state is it provides what looks like insurance to sheriff's departments. So I actually was involved in the defense of the Sandra Brown and the Sandra Bland claim. One of the things that I learned is in my job at TAC has been that jail is not a good place. Nothing much good happens in jail. And just as Dr. Bates said about better police, we need to have better jails in the state and everywhere. In fact, in every state in this country. It's no secret that the African American population is between 12 and 14% of the United States. But on average, African Americans are incarcerated at a rate 7 times greater than Caucasian Americans. And this is not just the case in a few states. This is the case in every state. In fact, there are some states where 72% of the people in jail are Black. And when you have those kinds of numbers, it's not a coincidence. Something is certainly going on here. I think we've all had the experience of passing someone who is stopped on the side of the road by a peace officer. And I will admit it's anecdotal evidence, but most of the time when I see somebody stopped, it's a non-white person. It's someone who is not driving a really nice car. It's someone who may be driving an older car or a car with body damage. It's someone that probably doesn't have money to do things like that. And I wonder, what did they do that I haven't done? Did they accidentally go through a red light? Did they maybe drive through the parking lot of the gas station to skip the traffic? What did they do? And this takes me back to Sandra Bland. I don't know if you recall seeing the footage of the video of the traffic stop of Miss Bland in Prairie View. It's hard to imagine that was over 4 years ago. But you'll recall that what she was stopped for was failing to signal her lane change. I almost never signal a lane change. My wife, my daughter, I wish I could say my daughter did, but I'm sure she doesn't. Yet, why does a white officer in Prairie View pull her over and clearly bait her, escalate the situation, threaten to arrest her for smoking a cigarette in her car? The last time I checked, it's not illegal to smoke in your car. Tell her that if she doesn't put her cigarette out, he's going to, quote, light her up. And what that means is using a taser. He got her dragged her out of the car, put her on the ground, on her stomach, and we all know from seeing the video of Mr. Floyd, law enforcement placing you on your stomach, or combined with, putting your knee on someone's neck, or even tying their hands behind their back or handcuffing them, is a very dangerous thing to do to someone's health. And that action by that trooper set into motion a horrible, horrible sequence of events that ended up, after the weekend, in Miss Bland being found hanged in her cell. One of the problems our jails have, and this is why county elections are so important and why state elections are so important, and even federal elections, is that it decides how much money the jails get. The oldest jail in this state is 120 years old. The Bland events happened in the Waller County Jail, which, to describe it as squalid, is generous. Thankfully, the citizens of Waller County changed some elected officials there who decided to build a new jail. Their tax base has gone up, and they were willing to make the changes. One of the things I think about when I watch all the, I'll just say, not going to say young, I'm going to say younger than me, most of them on television this week protesting, is that when it comes November, or when it comes time for a local or a state election, I hope that they get registered, or that we do something to get them registered to vote, that we inspire and teach them to ask hard questions of our political candidates, and make a concerted effort to elect candidates to office who are seriously interested in fixing our jails. One of the problems is there are, African Americans are arrested at much higher rates due to endemic poverty in many communities. They are unable to hire lawyers. They're given a public defender. And I know some very fine public defenders, but one of the things I know most about them is that they are horribly overworked. And that those are county employees. And again, it comes down to county funding. We're not willing at some levels to spend the money that it takes to fix this problem. And while money isn't all of it, money can change things. Because when we decide how we want to spend our money and what we're going to spend it on and why, it shows our true nature. We need to be spending our tax dollars on fixing our jails and helping our county deputies and our sheriffs, many of whom are very fine people, but they're overworked too. They don't have the money to pay their jailers. They don't have the money to have full staffs who can go around and make medical checks on people who, due to a variety of factors, are in compromised health situations and may need immediate health checks. I will tell you that in working with TAC, I handled probably 500 jail claims at least. I do not recall, except for a couple of instances where I had an African American defendant who was a county employee. It's by and far undereducated Caucasian people, many of whom have come directly from the oil field. You can always tell when the jail staff gets bigger that the price of crude is down and they're not making as much working in the oil field. They're not as disciplined as we would like to have them be. I think legislation that instituted a formal system of cell checks and put some real teeth in that when it's not done would be highly important. That's what happened to Sandra Bland. I recall during that time, on the day after she hanged herself, a colleague of mine from Houston and I met in Waller County at the jail, interviewed the sheriff, interviewed the jailers, and we saw the cell where Sandra Bland hanged herself. I can't share the picture with you, and that jail's been torn down anyway. But what happened, the facts of that case, and this was not disputed, was that there was a plastic trash sack or can in the cell with her. It's a pretty strong piece of plastic, something that makes awfully good news. And as best as I can describe it, in her cell, there was and you'll see this in many jails, there was a vertical partition between the sleeping quarters and the toilet for some degree of basic privacy. Now, directly above the partition, there was a light fixture. So they could not make the partition go all the way to the ceiling for the cause of the light fixture, which was just bad design. So the way that they retrofitted a jail cell that had a trash can in it was take a metal support that basically looked like this, like a goalpost at a football game, from here up to the ceiling, providing a perfect tie-off point. It did not appear that the jail was sufficiently staffed for the jailers to check on this bland. It was fairly obvious that she was in distress, that she had tried to commit suicide before. She was screened for that. And they didn't do it. And I don't think anyone was necessarily mean to her on purpose. These are just jailers who are so overworked and so understaffed that they just don't have the time to properly care for the inmates. You know, I have a friend who's a city council person on a local city council, and I see posts on Facebook that basically say, we have the lowest tax rate in the Metroplex. And I think, is that necessarily a good thing? Because although it's good for rich folks who have nice houses, it's not so good for poor folks. And unfortunately, it's a fact that African Americans are more likely to be disadvantaged. There is no public transportation where I live. They won't pay for it. So therefore, we have people driving around in bad cars that get pulled over because we're not willing to spend the money to make things better. I would gladly pay more taxes if it could get more resources to law enforcement. We have to make sure it's spent right. We have to make sure our state legislature is willing to make the right decisions, give the counties more freedom. We have to make sure our elected officials, especially our judges that we elect in the state of Texas and many other states elect their judges, that we're seriously questioning our judges about their policies about policing, about funding jails, and basic decency and human rights. These are among the best things we can possibly do as a society, because it will take collective action like we're seeing in cities across the nation. In fact, countries around the globe, they're marching in London for us. If we can work together and have a goal and put this at the top, solve this problem now, have a better criminal justice system. Going to jail is a terrible event, not just for the person that goes to the jail, because they are often not looked at, not properly screened, not checked on, subjected to excessive force at the hands of jailers, not given appropriate medical treatment. And I'm not trying to demonize our jails, because our jails have a problem. Our counties are poor. They can't afford to pay for the jails. It's a very, very complicated problem. But this we can fix by collective action, I believe. The energy is here. The time is here. So I pray that working together from all perspectives, that we can do this. And thank you all for inviting me. I'm very, very honored to be among the panelists. And it has been a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. We really appreciate that. We have some people in the chat saying Minister Christian hadn't introduced himself. You guys, he's coming up. He's coming up. He's gonna tell us about himself in just a bit. But right now, we're going to hear from Reverend Dr. Heidi Miller. Could you tell us about yourself first? Thank you.
Yes, it's so good to be with you, and what an honor to be gathered with you together at this time and join with. Truly, I am delighted, and also the warmest of love and greetings to every one of you who are gathered with us. We are with one another, and that is profound. And thank you for this opportunity. So I have been a Mennonite clergy and a Baptist, rooted in a non-violent tradition, although it tends to be peace at all costs, which is not really peace at all. That's problematic, part of our own journey. But I've really more Methonite. I work with lots of Methodists and have been a part of the Methodist Church, so it's better than being a menace.
I love it, Methonite.
It's better than being a menace. And I also direct the Masters of Practical Theology program at Pfeiffer University, and I'm also assistant professor of practical theology at that university in Charlotte area and region and beyond in North Carolina, and have had the opportunity to teach far and wide. But prior to that, was a medical social worker, social policy work, and then also a school counselor. So I brought that prior to going on for my own work and my PhD work, and I teach in the area of spirituality and worship. So I don't think it's an accident that at this time, this movement is booming. It's growing, it's happening, it's now. I don't think it's an accident. We have a pandemic within an epidemic. And the epidemic and the original sins, and many of them, there's many original sins, but racism is one of them, and we are swimming in it. And so when I teach spiritual practices and I teach worship and I work especially with embodiment, and even more so also with trauma and looking at that. So for a moment, we had been isolated in our homes, largely in a state of lockdown, so to speak, and had to function, many of us, more of an disembodied state where our brains are having to do the work normally that we're gathered face to face with one another, that we get to process just by merely of being embodied in one another's spaces to say, oh, I know how to take this in. I can process this. And all of that is having to be moved to the thinking method. So we're actually becoming more disembodied when we isolate off from one another. But then the proportionality of COVID cases, I was just looking on the Pew Research, 13% of our US population, current Pew Research, is Black American. 24% of COVID deaths are among Black Americans. So already in the isolation of our own homes and communities, our brothers and sisters are encountering a disproportionate death from a virus that is having us lose our breath. And how do we become breath givers instead of breath takers? We've just gone through Pentecost and are still in this season of Pentecost. And what does it mean to become breath givers instead of breath takers, especially when we can't breathe? And so this tumult of I can't breathe in the midst of a pandemic where we can't breathe and disproportionately cannot breathe, this is no accident, because we are embodied people. And so what's going on is that the whole bodily weight of this truth is hitting us. And I borrow that phrase from Thomas Troger because he calls out preachers and pastors to help people feel the bodily weight of truth, which starts me with, especially those who are gathered, who are call us believers or pastors or preachers, help our congregations and people encounter the bodily weight of truth. Do not sanitize the gospel. Don't patronize people with it, and don't put a nice bow on it. And when I say that, I'm going to use the story or a brief illustration of the woman with the hemorrhage. We, in this story, don't like to talk about bleeding. We don't like to talk about women's periods. We don't like to talk about women who are bleeding and hemorrhaging, blood on the street, so to speak. And she is ostracized from her community. And we say, oh, isn't it great that Jesus healed her? The whole story and framework and any healing that you're going to find in the scripture is not only for the individual. Every single healing in the scriptures that Jesus does is for an entire community. And this woman's bleeding is really the whole community that's implicated by it. It's not just about this woman. It really is a whole community. And if you notice the very posture, and again, this is bodily, and I'm going to have us actually notice a prayer posture that we can take in time. But if you notice the very posture that at first this woman starts out within the story, she is starting out from below to touch the hem of Jesus's garment. Jairus approaches Jesus at the same time on his way to heal Jairus's daughter from the front and kneels down in front of Jesus. And when Jesus asks, "Who touched me?" the power goes out of him, speaking of empowerment and the use of power. When he asked, "Who touched me?" she actually comes and uses the same posture and stance that Jairus does. She changes her posture in relation to the community. And actually the scripture tells us in Mark 5 and also Luke 8 that she comes from around the front until she comes. Jesus says, "Who touched me?" Now Jesus knows. We know Jesus knows. It's not for the sake of Jesus knowing who touched her. It's so the community can actually hear this woman's story, and it shifts her whole posture, bodily posture, to the front of Jesus in the same posture as Jairus. She approaches him now as Jairus, the leader in the temple, or Jairus, the leader in temple, approaches them, which shows us something. And then she tells her story in the whole community. This is what is going on. We have sisters and brothers who are dying, whose stories have not been allowed to be told, lest they be labeled. We label our sisters and brothers as angry. And now these stories are being allowed to erupt and be told. And already in the midst of this time, let's use this time to encounter the bodily weight of this truth, because there are communities that are touching the hem of Christ, and we are called to join with, and we are called to listen to the story. And that's that powerful work of Jesus, just like Reverend Dr. Tamara Lewis shared in terms of how Jesus calls us into community. This is the very turn. The healing related to COVID, the healing is not just for the individual, it's for whole communities. The healing of the way policing happens is not just for the individual police officer, it's for a whole community. The healing of the way we do church. And here's the rub. We are not going to move forward as a church, as a body, in the changing reality of the church without the skill set of our overcomers among us. Because quite frankly, many of us as whites get tired and we quit when we're tired. Because when we're offended, we get tired. Now, I have been offended many a times, and it has taken me many, many, many conversions as a white woman to recognize that I am swimming in my own racism because I was embedded in it, embodied in it, my body. Just think for a moment. A mother on an elevator with a child, black man coming on the elevator, and she grips the child tighter. That child grows up and she keeps gripping the hand of that child tighter and tighter. Guess what is embedded in that infant, toddler, and child? That's just an example of an embedding process. And so we will not get out of this only by having conversation. There needs to be a shift in the content. Discontent, as Martin Luther King Jr. talks about it. I will not tell my people to get rid of their discontent. And he's speaking really to whites who want to go back to somehow the way things were. And that's our temptation in humanity. I don't care who we are. We're going to grip for what we know, because to change in formation, transformation, is going to be very, very difficult. But if we walk with communities and listen to overcomers, we will actually begin to have a skill set that gets embedded in us. And there's so many figures. I'm going to say every student I have had has become my teacher. Every student, because a community is formed in a classroom, and also every church, a community is formed. And you may say, yeah, but I'm in a white church. I don't know what to do. What do I do? Where do I start? Well, Jesus started with, what do you have? What do you got? And the disciples were like, we got nothing. We got nothing. Good. Because that is sharing and showing that we aren't going to get out of this alone. That's actually a good start. That's a good spot, but it's uncomfortable. It's really uncomfortable. Ruby Sales is a public theologian. She herself is a veteran civil rights leader who came to the forefront in 1965 when a white seminarian dove in front of a bullet in Alabama that was directed at her as they were working in the civil rights movement. He died instantly. She dedicated her life in time to being a public theologian and has started the Spirit House Project in his honor and memory. Ruby Sales, and I invite every single person here. I will try to do put into the link, Krista Tippett's podcast on being, an interview with Ruby Sales is breath-giving. She talks about the poverty among white people. The physical poverty in our regions and rural areas, but the deep spiritual poverty of feeling like something is being lost. And she says, it will feel like a death. And she said that the reality, the death to leave something and move towards something new. She says, and the spiritual poverty of knowing what to do when we feel like we're going to die in our frameworks. And she said, white people go and ask the question, where does it hurt? She said, because the traction of hatred and white supremacy that it gets in that stream is high. And she said, and I'm calling you there. And that may be your track. Speaking of track. The Johnsons at the beloved community center in Greensboro, North Carolina, and being now in North Carolina, Reverend Nelson and Joyce Johnson, who began, also veteran civil rights leaders. They too were part of the community movement in Greensboro. If you recall, Greensboro is the site of the sit-ins, but the sit-ins are happening all over, but the sit-ins that got the most traction at the Woolworth counter. They also were part of a march when the KKK, which is still active in North Carolina, but they were also part of a march at that time in which the KKK came and began to release bullets upon the crowd, and a white woman covered one of their children and she died. They dedicated themselves to the whole cause and have the beloved community center in Greensboro. My husband and I had the privilege of being under their tutelage. They spent the whole first day with leaders, those of us who were educational leaders or pastors, and they helped us touch, where does it hurt? What's bleeding? Where does it hurt for you? Now, I sat there holding back tears for 4 hours as they brought us to that place, because I could not believe that they had the grace to sit and listen to some of what was being shared. And it has changed my life. But that is not everybody's call, but it is asking a deeper question: where does it hurt? And are we in a posture of being with that? So spiritual practices, what do we practice in light of all of that? Where does it hurt? What stuff is going on inside of me? What's being bumped up against? The other is a misnomer that I began to believe over time and taught for a while and shifted. And that was that in spirituality the goal was to come to peace, inner peace. Well, when you have whole communities who are living in a cancerous society, that is not going to be possible. We're actually equipping people to be resilient overcomers. And so when I teach at the very basic, some of you may have heard of breath prayers. The start of praying, of course, is listening, but breath, which is given in the nostrils of humanity in Genesis 2, often we teach breathing in the love of God and breathing out all that binds, which is a very powerful prayer practice, just simply using your breath, which you can do, which I'm not going to have us do that one. I'm going to stretch us. And this is the second practice. That's the flip side. We are breathing in the toxicity around us. And we are breathing out beloved community. We are breathing in the toxicity around us, and we are breathing out beloved community. And this is what God enables. This is the work. The toxins. In Revelation, there's a picture of the tree for the healing of the nations. By the way, the tree is in the middle of the neighborhood with a river on each side. And on the tree are leaves for the healing of the nations. The trees take in toxins and they breathe out oxygen. And we are learning to become those leaves. And it's going to take a lot of hard work and a lot of time. And it's going to take a lot of work to pull aside white people in white congregations and begin to get out what is the pain and the work. And instead of talking about doing something for people, I really encourage us to change the shift from for to with. Emmanuel with us. Echo that. So if you're doing ministries, how are you ministering with? How are you noticing what's already happening so that you can join with to empower, not just for, but with? This is that shift of posture that Jesus calls for already. So just for a moment, breathe in all those toxins that are already in the air. And breathe out, beloved community. Our bodies are the body of Christ, and we are the fulcrum of breathing and being beloved community. It is an honor to be beloved community with you this night. Amen.
And let the church say amen. Dr.
Amen.
Dr. Miller, you have been a blessing to me since my time at Perkins, and nothing has changed. Thank you very much for that. And I know that we're well into the second, or going into the third hour of this conversation, so I won't hold you long with my part. But for the most part, my name is Christian Watkins, Minister Christian Watkins. I am currently the Wendland Fellow for Faith and Justice with the General Board of Church and Society of the United Methodist Church. Long
An
title.
awesome one.
What'd you say?
An awesome one, by the way.
Thank you. I'm currently here in DC from Dallas, Texas, serving with the General Board of Church and Society, empowering and equipping United Methodists from the North Texas and Central Texas Conference in order to do advocacy work on the local level as well as on the federal level. So this is literally my job, and it's been a blessing nonetheless. But being here in DC, I had the opportunity to go participate in the protests yesterday. And, you know, being out there with the people and whatnot, and experiencing the love of protest. I posted pictures on Facebook, and one of my seminary leaders, she commented on my Facebook post. She's like, Christian, thank you very much for standing up and being standing in the gap and representing us. And I instantly replied to her and said, you know, it's part of my heritage and my calling. It's unescapable that I participate in these kind of activities, because not only was my mother a justice advocate in her day, working in Ohio as well as in Houston, Texas. It's who God called me to be. It took me 15 years after I heard the calling to ministry, but I ran from that calling, and I just experienced a lot of hell in the process, I'm not gonna lie. And once I turned the corner and finally accepted the call, acknowledged God's call, everything just shifted. It seems like my life just shifted into what it is today. And I just thank God for hanging with me and not dropping the phone call. But I say all that to say this process that I've been on, of becoming a justice warrior, becoming a person who stands in the gap for others and advocates for justice. It is a long, arduous process. You know, it's kind of painful coming to the realization of that need, but once you come to the realization of being that person who God called to be, because we all have a calling on our lives, we all have a purpose for being on this planet. We're not just called to be here for ourselves, we're called to be here in community, because there is no us, there is no me without us. I'm standing on the shoulders of my ancestors, and I'm standing with those who grew up around me and with the elders that are before me. So there is no pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps if we didn't make the boots or the straps that we're pulling on. So once we come to that realization, everything should just fall in line when we actually lean into that, as well as hear from valuable resources and read and connect with beautiful people like I'm being surrounded with today. I have a short story of my progress, of what really solidified who I am. It was during my first couple of months at Perkins School of Theology, when there was a fraternity that decided to throw a blackface party. Advertising and whatnot went out. The school ended up, luckily the party did not exist. The party wasn't held. However, the backlash and the blacklash, we lashed out. We were like, okay, this might be a predominantly white institution, a United Methodist institution, but there are Black bodies on this campus, and we will not be ignored in this travesty. So while hearing all of the concerns of my fellow seminarians, as well as from undergraduates around the campus, and seeing the turmoil that was unraveling on campus, you know, I just felt in my heart that something had to be done. And I did not do it alone. I had the consultation of Dr. Lewis, as well as other professors, as well as other partners in the struggle, other seminarians who were with me, who were deeply affected, but also felt convicted to do the work that was necessary to unravel the situation and to make things better. So me, along with my colleagues, there was 2 others, Robin Murray and Forrest Turner. We got together with our professors. We said, hey, what can we do? We planned a march. We planned a prayer vigil to allow people to grieve in a sacred space, as well as to move throughout the campus in solidarity, marched from Perkins up the hill to Dallas Hall, where we had another prayer vigil. And the president of the university met us. We had prayers out there. We voiced our concerns for being Black at SMU. And that is a hashtag, that is a Twitter hashtag, if you want to go ahead and follow up with that, just to confirm the story. And you'll see the new stories that have come out since then, especially for such a time as this. But during that movement, the power of God moved around us so well that the administration decided to have regular meetings with minorities on campus, to institute certain changes on campus and certain offices in order to combat racial disparity on campus. And those works are still going on. So I say all that to say this: the work is hard, but living in a racist society is harder. And we must do something about it. So with that, I would like to turn over to my PowerPoint in order to look through some ways of being active right now, especially during this time. So let's see. One of the tools that we have at our disposal, working with General Board of Church and Society, we have what's called the Creating Change Together, a toolkit for faithful civic engagement. And if you go to our website, the www.umcjustice.org, you'll see this main landing page here that you see here on the bottom. And from that, you can look in resources and type in Creating Change Together, or just click on the link when you click on this link when you get it in your email. And you will see this civic engagement toolkit. And it has lots of tips that you can use in order to find your story, like the story I just told you, to own it and to be able to move from that place of insecurity to a place of power and empowering others, right? So, and also on the General Board of Church and Society website, and if you sign up for action alerts and to be kept in the know about what's happening with GBCS, you'll find that there's a action item on here that says take action, systemic racism and discrimination during COVID-19, and the link is active within this presentation that you'll get. And basically it sends a form letter that's already been given to you in order to advocate to congressional leaders the necessity for implementing anti-racism legislation, right? Because that it is exposed to us. There's no one that can claim ignorance now that Black folks are being disproportionately discriminated against in this country, or disproportionately disparaged in this country. And COVID-19 has given us time to take pause to understand that fact. Now it's time for us to move, and our legislators, elected officials, must take part in that action. Now, there's a number of organizations that have that are in this fight, that are developed, that are organized in order to combat not just racism, but also the different plethora of issues that affect affect everybody in our country, from the least to the greatest, to the blackest, from the blackest to the whitest, and everybody in between. Men, women, LGBT communities, that kind of thing, those kinds of persons. So, but for this moment that we're in right now, for the George Floyd moment, for the I Can't Breathe Still moment, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights has published a letter, has sent a letter to Congress, prioritizing federal policies, or listing federal policies that could be, that are to be introduced through Congress in order to mitigate police brutality. So if you Google the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, you'll be able to find that information in their press releases, as well as a plethora of other issues that they are advocating, that they are working in, right? And then for my folks in Dallas, we got to get active. We have to participate in the Civic Center, whether it's on the city level or on the federal level or anywhere in between. So this Friday, tomorrow at 2 p.m., there's going to be a special called council meeting, city council meeting, that will address these issues and the need for a better policing oversight system, right? So if you are in Dallas, find the City of Dallas website, City Hall page, and please attend that meeting and hear the voices of the disparaged in that meeting. And I guarantee you there'll be some action items that will be presented to you during that meeting. Now, we know that police brutality is only a symptom, is only a manifestation of racism, but that's not the only symptom. I mean, that's not the only manifestation. It happens in immigration policies, in poverty and hunger issues, in a lot of in everyday aspects of life. So it's incumbent upon us to be able to, find our niche, find what we're passionate about, and lean into it, become knowledgeable of it, and find those pieces of legislation and our elected officials who can help move the needle of progress. So the Black Maternal Health Caucus, that's linked right here on this page, has issued a Omnibus Act of 2020 that's been accepted in Congress, and they're in the process of marking it up and debating that health bill that will combat maternal health disparities in our country. And Representative Ilhan Omar just announced the slate of bills to address the George Floyd murder and the congressional actions that are necessary to combat those disparities from the federal level. And then right now in the books, there's House Bill, there's House Resolution 5717, the Gun Violence Prevention and Community Safer Act of 2020. You can call your elected officials, you can call your federal officials and ask their office, hey, what are you doing about this? Or you can go to congress.gov and find out what bills are currently on the books, what bills are currently being debated. Now, there is a lot of information out there, and there are a lot of bills that are on the books that could be analyzed and whatnot. And we can't, just looking through any one of these websites can fatigue you. But hang tough and know that God is with you through this process. And greater is He that is in me. Greater is the one that is in me, in us, than he that is in the world, or she that is in the world. But also another way to progress from that corner of charity work to turn the corner to justice work. It's incumbent upon us to become knowledgeable of the organizations that are doing the on-the-ground work currently. This is a list, a very impartial list, a very minuscule list compared to the actual organizations that are out there who are doing on-the-ground work. The National Action Network, that is Reverend Al Sharpton's network, the one he's a figurehead of. They are doing tremendous work here in Washington and all across the country. The Leadership Council on Civil and Human Rights, I mentioned them. You have local organizations like Faith in Texas and another in the Dallas Black Clergy Group and Dallas Doing Good. Those organizations that are doing on the ground local work. Then you have national organizations like Faith in Action. Faith in Action and Faith in Public Life, and the National Council of Churches and the Church World Service, who are doing advocacy on the federal level and working with local principalities in order to navigate that local work into the federal level. And of course, you have what I've mentioned, my organization, the General Board of Church and Society, and the General Commission on Race and on Religion and Race. Those two organizations are specifically working with United Methodist Church and on behalf of the United Methodist Church to help us turn the corner. So there's a number of organizations that you can get connected with. And like I said, these links will be active in the PowerPoint and presentation that you all receive in the days ahead. So just to recap, be prayerful, get informed, and act faithfully. You know, you have to find your story, know your story, tell your story, and get your people to understand your story so that they can stand with you in solidarity to do the work of justice in the community. Join and financially support organizations doing on-the-ground work. That is very crucial. Right now, if you look at Instagram or Twitter or even on Facebook, you will have a number of those kind of posts circulating right now. Support minority-owned businesses. We desperately need to support those organizations so that they can experience the economic impact of love, of justice in the community, more so than the big box stores and those kind of, and the people who have the money, the 1%. Sign petitions, communicate with congressional representatives, know and be in contact with your elected officials, and most crucially, go vote in every single election that you can, because a voteless people are a voiceless people, and we don't, and silence is a sin at this point. So after we, like I said, one more time, we'll be publishing this and all of our contact information will be available. And so I hope that that was actually fruitful for you all as a quick rundown of how to live out your faith in action in the public square.
Thank you so much, Christian. Thank you so much. This has been, let me just tell you guys, this has been,
yeah.
This is what I needed. And I hope that it has blessed other people. The conversation can't stop here. We know that there were a lot of questions in the chat room, but there was so much information that we wanted to give you. And we have other resources too that we will add to that. Let me just say this. I watched the memorial service today. At the end of that service, I stood with them for 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
It felt like an eternity. But one thing that they said during that time was, and they kept saying this, the family's message is, we can't do it alone. We are stronger together. Black people, white people, Asian people, everybody, we are stronger together. And the only way we're gonna get there, just listen to everything that everyone said. There are ways that we can get there. We gotta stick together and we have to keep the conversation going. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you guys so much. I'm telling you, when I tell you, you bless my spirit, I'm telling you, you bless my spirit. The comments in the chat room have blessed my spirit. And I hope that you have been blessed too. And not just blessed to go out and say something. Let us actively, intentionally do something. Do something. Minister Christian Watkins, if you could, because I'm tore up now. Can you pray us out?
Most definitely I can.
Pray us out.
Most definitely I can. Most definitely I can. If you all would, let us attain an attitude of gratitude for this day and lean into God's presence. Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide my face in thee, and I will be completely, and I will give you all the great praise and glory from hence now and from evermore. God, you are with us. I feel you moving with us. Your hand is protecting us. Your hand is moving in society, and your spirit of Pentecost is living strong. And we give you praise for it, Lord. Give you praise for the lives of the panelists that are on this call, as well as the participants and their partners in faith and in work that they are connected with. Lord, move us in a mighty way, in a way that only you know how, that is edifying for all people, for Black lives that matter, for all lives that matter, because you know, because you have created us good. Lead us back to that. Help us, lead us, guide us, bring us closer together. And your name will be glorified until the end of the days. All these things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Keep living faithfully, seeking justice, and pursuing peace. Good night. Until the next time.
Amen. Bye-bye, y'all.